Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Breeze Time with Kathy. I'm Kathy Howell, the chaplain of the Hermitage, and it's good to talk to you again this way. Oh, the weather. Have you noticed the last couple of days there was a little bit of freshness in the air? Fall. It reminded me of fall. Boy, it's amazing how the weather can bring back so many memories for me. And so many memories for my husband, Chuck. He grew up in rural Mississippi, and the weather would turn cool like this, and he'd start talking about stuff like when he was a boy, how they liked to go hunting. It was a tough time. It was back in the 30s and in late 30s, early 40s, and in rural Mississippi. He grew up on a farm, and they used to go hunting quite a bit, squirrel hunting or rabbit hunting. There wasn't any game bigger than that. And of course they ate what they brought home, and his mom cooked what he shot. And he always had hunting dogs. He had hunting dogs. He said he had one dog that was so smart. If Chuck didn't have his gun with him, the dog was laid back and just a pet. But the minute he picked up his rifle, he said that dog would start watching him. And if he was looking up in the trees, the dog was looking up in the trees for squirrels. And if he was looking in the bushes, the dog was looking in the bushes to see if he could find any rabbits. I mean, it's amazing how animals can be. But Chuck really enjoyed his days in Mississippi. He said he used to take to that, and his mom used to laugh about how much he liked to go tromping through the woods and hunting and all. And she said, "Well, I can tell you're kin to Daniel Boone." Well, he didn't think much of that, but it turns out that on his mother's side, Daniel Boone was his fifth great uncle. They share. So maybe, his mom's jokes were true. He was kin to Daniel Boone. It's amazing how times were so different back then. He said the boys, of course, he only had about 5. There was a total of 5 boys in his class and 4 girls. And he said the boys would decide when fall was coming and it was time to go hunting, that they just thought they needed a hunting day. So they'd all do their work ahead of time for the next day, they said. Of course, maybe Chuck was just trying to tell me to please me, but whatever. He said they'd do their work ahead, but he would take it back. I believe he was an honest man. They do their work. They catch up on their work and try and do a little bit ahead of time. And then the next day, they'd all go to school. They'd all come to school, but they'd get on the bus with their guns and their dogs. Can you believe that? Kids getting on the bus with their guns and their hunting dogs. And then they'd all meet at school, and instead of going to class, they'd all go out and go hunting. He said sometimes they'd even invite the principal, and once or twice he came with them. I said, "Well, what did the girls do on that day?" "Oh, the girls, they knew they were hunting. They'd planned something else, I said, "I can't believe you did that." He said, "Oh yeah, it was the way things were done back then in the country." I'm thinking, it sounds to me like you grew up in another century for me, and I was only about 20-something years younger than he was. But it was a difference too between being on a farm and growing up in a suburb in the 50s, like I did, 50s and 60s. It was just all the difference in the world. But I used to love to listen to his stories. He really used to tell wonderful stories about how things were back then. He said one day, he remembers his mom was ironing. She had a gas-powered, kerosene-powered iron. I don't know. I remember we saw one in the antique store once. He said, "Oh, that's just like the one my mother had." And he showed it to me. Well, she was ironing, and the windows were open. And he said it was kind of stormy outside, and all of a sudden, ball lightning came through the house. A streak of lightning came through the house, went in one window and out the other. I said, "You are lying to me." He said, "No, I'm not. It's the truth." And sure enough, later on, I was talking to some of his classmates he introduced me to when we were on a visit up to Mississippi. And don't you know, they brought up the story about how his mother was ironing and the lightning came through their house. Good grief. I can't imagine. He said he'd also seen ball lightning. Ball lightning is a very rare manifestation of lightning, but it looks like a big glowing ball. He said they were out there in the yard. It had rained, but then that was the time. He said his dad used to make a little money selling potato starts, which I said, "What's potato starts?" He said, "Well, you have a big mound of dirt, and what you do is you take the eye of the potato and you cut it up and you stick it in the ground and you get the potatoes growing that way." And a lot of people, used to like that shortcut in order to start the potatoes. And I said, "Okay." He said, "Now the time to sell potato starts is just after a rain." So my dad was out there and I was out there too, and we were selling potatoes. He was selling potato starts, and all of a sudden, he had a man over to buy potato starts, and all of a sudden, a big ball of lightning came and rolled down the ground, came between Chuck and his father and the man who was buying the potato starts, headed over to the mound where the potato starts was, and exploded. It was ball lightning, something I had never heard of. Actually, after Chuck told me that story, we were dating when he told me that story, so I had to go look up ball lightning to make sure it was a real thing, because I hadn't heard of it, and it was real, And you know how it is. You got to check them out. Sometimes guys you're dating can be telling you wild tales, but it was the truth. It was ball lightning. And he said that actually on that spot for the next 10 years nothing would grow. And don't you know, I read in the encyclopedia, I guess it was encyclopedia back then, I don't know, I don't think I had the ability to look it up on the internet, that the lightning will sterilize the ground and everything will die, and it'll take years for life to, plants and all to start growing again, because you have to get the microbes into the soil in order to make the nitrogen do something so that the plants can grow. So it takes time to rebuild the structure. The number of things. And then he told me about the big red oak tree. He said that their house stood under a giant red oak tree. It was the biggest red oak tree that anybody had ever seen, and it grew right there, right behind their house. And he says, as a matter of fact, that's one of the reasons his parents built the house right there when they got married in like 1928. The land was right there where, it turns out that Chuck's mother and father grew up on adjoining farms, and where their land came together, that was where they went ahead and they built their house. They were given a patch of land. They were given something like 80 acres, I think, 82 acres or 86 acres, something like that. And they went ahead and built their house there. And I was real surprised at kind of a neat story. Turns out his grandfather had been in the Civil War, of course on the Confederate side, but they were in Mississippi. So I remember we looked up his grandfather, and actually his great-grandfather who lived there, and turns out that that was his grandparents. Turns out that they used to own slaves, And when Chuck found that out, he felt real bad about it. They only owned about 8, which was kind of small, which indicates they were small, but Chuck always felt bad about it. You know, his last name is Howell, and bless his heart, he said he was a traffic police officer, and he said after that, if he ever stopped an African American with the last name Howell, he just couldn't give him a ticket because he felt guilty that just maybe his ancestors had owned this man's ancestors, and that was just plain wrong. Strange story, I suppose. Yeah, tough time. I didn't mean to get off on that track. I guess what I really wanted to talk about was that giant red oak tree. Well, that red oak tree was so old, it was on some of the first survey maps. Apparently it was virgin timber, and it really was huge. And and there again, I'd wondered if Chuck had exaggerated. But we talked to when I met some of his high school friends, his school friends, they said they talked about that red oak tree and how big it was. That was the biggest. Everybody would kind of, when they got around to that, they said, oh, that red oak tree was the biggest red oak tree I ever saw. Same thing. I remember Chuck hadn't been up to the home place where he was raised because it had been sold. He had sold it years ago, and after his father died in the early 60s, and he had sold it, and he just hadn't been back until he took me to go to show me where he grew up. I'll never forget when he drove up the road and he saw that the red oak tree was gone, and so was his house. He was shocked. He drove up there. You know, we went up the drive and we saw somebody in the yard, and so we went up the driveway, and it turns out that the man who owns it is the man that Chuck originally sold the property to so many years before. And he said, what happened to the red oak tree in the house? And he said, well, what happened to the house? And he said, well, you wouldn't believe it. You know that giant wet red oak tree behind? He said, well, you have to remember that was kind of on the back side of the hill. And little by little, the rain washed away the side of the hill. And that red oak tree became clay-rooted, is the word he used for it. But what he meant was that half the roots, the dirt got washed away from half the roots. And little by little, he said one day he left home to go down to the hardware store, the feed store, hardware store, and which was only down the road of just about 5 or 6 miles. And he was not there more than about 5 minutes when somebody comes in and says to him, man, what happened to your house? And he said, what? And he went back and he said, yeah, that big red oak tree, you know, that giant red oak tree, it fell on your house. Your house is smashed. Well, it turns out there was nobody home because he just left a few minutes before, apparently. It fell, and it wasn't raining, the wind wasn't blowing. Guess it just been weakened enough that it fell, and it crashed down on his house. And he said the house was demolished. We were driving, I remember we were driving one of those 1980 conversion vans. You remember them? The ones with the captain's chairs in the middle, 1990. Those conversion vans. So they're pretty big, those full-size conversion vans. And he said there were limbs on that tree as big as that van. I can't tell you how hard it was to get that tree chopped up and moved out of here. He said it wasn't that it had hollowed out inside or anything. He said it was just a matter of the mud being washed away from the backside of the hill little by little over time, and finally it just wasn't enough roots to support it. Yeah, Chuck had some strong memories, and he said the house was so demolished, it was just crushed. And by the time we managed to get that tree off of it and cut it away, he said was hard. We had to call in professionals, and even they didn't have chainsaws big enough. They'd cut half of it, then half of it again, and they'd often have to V-shape it out and then cut it in order to pull that tree off of it. And he said, yeah, the house is just totally demolished. So the insurance company paid me off, and I ended up building a new one. I remember Chuck was a little disappointed to see his home place gone. The things from his memories. That red oak tree that his grandmother said she'd played under when she was a child, and it was just as big then as it was when Chuck was a boy. And that was because it was the largest red oak tree and stood at the top of near the top of a hill. And so the surveyors had left it. The original surveyors of the property, before any European Americans white people had ever moved into the area, they'd left it there. And as a marker, as a survey marker. And that was one of the trees that didn't get logged out in the logging days that were so plentiful in that part of Mississippi. Back in the early to mid 1800s, when they just thought that nobody could ever chop down all the timber that was in the United States. But we managed to do it, didn't we? There's only a few stands of virgin timber, timber the way it was when the Native Americans had free control and free reign. Those kind of huge trees. No. That tree was gone. Its roots didn't hold. Chuck's roots ran deep into his memories of his childhood. And I really believe it was the fact of the faith that his mother and father had, the way they took him to church every Sunday. Now, his father was Baptist and his mother was Methodist, but that didn't matter because there was only one church. And the Methodist traveling preacher would come twice a month, and the Baptist traveling preacher would come twice a month, and they used the same church building, and the same people came. It's just some people were registered as Baptist and some people were registered as Methodist. And he said, and if there was a fifth Sunday in the month, well, they just had a singing service. Yeah. You see, his faith ran deep too. And even though he'd wandered, he used to say, because in his 20s, he got real discouraged. And I think I told you about that. And for a lot of different reasons, he walked away. He turned his back on God. He said it wasn't that he didn't believe he existed, it's just he told himself, well, he'd get along fine without God. I have to admit, I went through the same kind of thing. He wouldn't ask God for anything, and he'd just do his thing. He said that was wandering in the desert. He later described it, I wandered in the desert for 40 years. Almost 40 years, I suppose. Yeah, maybe it was 40. And then, because his roots ran deep, he began, after God brought us together, and I truly believe God brought us together. I know I've said that before. You're probably tired of hearing it, but he began to feel God's calling, God, that he just needed a relationship, that he needed something more. That's all he felt. He said, I just need something more. And I told you how he started going back to the Methodist church, and I went with him, and little by little we found more, a lot more. See, his roots ran deep. But unlike that red oak tree, fortunately, it wasn't so much had washed away that it keeled over like that tree did, like his faith was completely going. No, by the grace of God, all those good positive memories he was raised on, and the solid faith, and the strong roots about ethics and what was right and God that his parents planted in him, those roots hung in there. I hope that I know my parents planted solid roots in me, and I'm the one who walked away, much like Chuck did, but for different reasons at a different time. Yet somehow, I began to feel too, as Chuck felt, that I wanted more. And when I turned to God looking for more, oh, he gave it. He gave it to Chuck, he gave it to me. I think he gives it to everybody. You know, the memories of our childhood, it's amazing the things we remember. And a lot of times if we look at our memories, the reason that the ones that stand out so clear are because they were important, one to us in one way or the other. It's true some things trigger them, like the weather did. Used to trigger all those memories that Chuck had about being a boy. Because and I know that same thing happened. When I smelled the fresh, cold air, I started thinking about fall and things I remembered from my childhood, which I'll save for another time. No, our memories become very important. Where we've been has a lot to do with nourishing us so that we can keep on the places we're going. I hope all of you are deeply rooted at some point in your being. I hope you find in your life and through your connections with where you've been, and hopefully God's part of all that, you find the strength you need to take the next step, and whatever that'll be, get through the next day. Put one foot in front of the other on life's journey. It's funny, we never get to see too far ahead. But we see far enough ahead to know that someone's there for us. I hope you feel it too. All right, I didn't mean to preach a sermon. I usually just like to keep this time light and enjoyable, but you know, there's a cool, freshness in the air today. Reminds me of fall. Made me all nostalgic. So, please forgive me. And until next time, God bless you.